If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Glad you could join me today. In my work, I talk a lot about attention compass and explain that it's a system and a set of workflows. People respond a little bit oddly to that because when I say workflows, they immediately go to process and instruction and guidance to follow and rules and structure and all this sort of thing. And they say, look, I want to be not that. I want to be less structured rather than more. I want to be creative. I want to be spontaneous and just don't want to be rigidly structured. I don't want to feel regimented. These ideas come up. So in this episode, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And my goal is to help you take away a mindset that's really going to put those fears to rest for you. In order to do that, I'll talk about a concept called the operational aspects of your life. I'll define that. We'll talk about what it means, and then we'll talk about what happens if you begin to handle these operational aspects very well. My experience shows that managing these operational things well increases your bandwidth and opportunities for this non-systematized stuff, this non-rigorous stuff. And people give it different names. Spontaneity is a big one. Personally, I like playfulness. A lot of people say, well, I need time for creativity. So we'll talk about all of that in this episode. So first, let's lay out the problem. We want creativity and spontaneity in our lives. We don't want to feel like we're living in Army basic training. And I get that. I'm very much that way myself. I like to think of myself as a playful, inventive kind of guy. It's not easy, after all, to come up with dad jokes all the time. But we think of that as being the opposite of structure. And I'm going to suggest to you that that tension between those two ideas is not really there. I've heard this concept put several ways, and one of them is, boundaries allow us to be fully open and fully exploratory within those boundaries because we know we have safety. We're not worried about bad things happening, so we can explore and create. And I think that we'll get into that a little bit, what the mechanism is for that in our own lives. But I just say that it's not really that much of a problem. And the way this, I'll say, operationalizes in our world is you probably spend a lot more attention and thus time on identifying your own tasks and on managing the operational aspects of your life than you think you do. And if you want to test me on this, it's pretty straightforward, although not terribly easy. Just document the time you spent in a day or in a week actually dealing with coming up with your task list and managing your task list and dealing with the operational things in your life. And I'll define what that is. And I think you'll be surprised, not only at how much time it takes, but about how much focus and attention it takes. And so if you spend time on it but are not able to focus on it well, then that time expands or that time is wasted. So we'll lay out this concept of the operational aspects of our lives. We'll talk a little bit about a contribution from one of my favorite business authors, and his name's Patrick Lencioni, and I've probably referred to him before because I've learned a lot from him. And we'll talk about operations in business, and then we'll bring that back out into our lives and think about, well, here's how businesses manage operations efficiently and effectively. So maybe we should consider taking those lessons and processes and applying them to our lives. We'll talk about the notion that the environment is really forcing us to manage more of our own things than it used to. And I'll explain why that is and what that challenge is for us as we deal with that. And then we'll talk about routinizing things and how we might do that. But to begin at the beginning, the phrase operational aspects of our lives, I got it from David Allen. But I looked and I was doing some research and I can only find one instance of him using it, but I love it. And I think it's an important concept for us to get in our hands and to think about some in this area of creativity, spontaneity. So when we think about the operational aspects of our lives, we will draw a parallel from business. So in the business world, in the organizational world, operations is a big deal. Quite often, the operational aspects of a business are those things that keep the business running. They're the things that really just are not terribly sexy. They are pretty mundane, pretty routine, usually. But when they go wrong, it's a bad problem. The examples in our own lives are there's a ton of them. So your plumbing in your house, when it's working well, you hardly even notice it. When it's working poorly, all of a sudden, it's a big deal. And that's an operational aspect of what's going on. And it's pretty easy to just forget that these things are there at all. But there's many of them. You know, when you go out to your car in the morning and you start it up, you expect for it to start. And if it doesn't start, then all of a sudden there's this problem. So these are these operational aspects. And again, managing them is not sexy. It has something of a low return on investment relative to other ways we could be using our attention. And so I'll talk to you about a mindset for managing these operational aspects. And then we'll move on into what impact that has on I'm just going to use the word creativity. Business focuses on operations, and businesses that are large enough have a chief operations officer. And the normal responsibilities of the chief operations officer is to make sure that the processes of the business are processing. And in the older parts of the economy, that includes product operations. I say the older parts of the economy. I'm thinking about the factory economy, where operations would typically include the factory floor and making sure that product was getting produced. It wasn't always a part of operations. Sometimes there was a production officer as well. But these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about when we think about operations. It's very important. And even now, where I live is close to a Mercedes plant. And from time to time, you'll hear somebody in the business school talk about the cost if the assembly line at Mercedes should go down for, say, an hour. And it's this staggering cost per hour because they're not producing. Now, day in, day out, they are producing, and the system runs fairly flawlessly a lot of the time. But if it were to go down, it would be a crisis. And that's the nature of this operation stuff. So in the newer parts of the economy, in the knowledge work economy, operations is more about running kind of the whole business. and we don't have these physical processes as much as we used to. And so all of that knowledge management and all these different ideas tend to fall under the heading of operations. So again, I'll just reemphasize, we think of, somehow we attach the word trivial with operational things. And I think that's because they normally work so well. And they normally work so well that we don't feel the need to think about them. But they're really not trivia. Now, at the same time, routine management of these things doesn't produce some huge profitability to the business. It doesn't produce some huge return on investment because things just work. And innovation is not typically required. Now, in an emergency, as with Mercedes, if the plant's down and let's just say it costs them $1 million an hour, that's not the right number, but it's not way, way off. All of a sudden, the ROI of hours spent to solve that problem skyrockets because you can put 100 guys on there at $100 an hour, and that's savings against this $1 million per hour cost of the factory line being down. So it's not trivia. Okay. It's not that it's not important. It's just that it's routinized to the point where it typically doesn't require our attention. Now, this is in organizations and particularly in businesses. So operations, the management of operations then is about making the running of the business as routine as it can be. Because no manufacturing company, well, it's a rare manufacturing company that can make a whole lot of money out of how well it uses its water supply. And again, this is this non-symmetrical relationship. When it's running smoothly, we don't ascribe any value to it. But when it's broken, all of a sudden problems get really, really expensive. And just think about the plumbing in your house. So we're thinking about the fact that businesses manage, they spend attention and time and dollars and salary on making sure operations stays operational. I'll move to Patrick Lencioni, who I mentioned in the intro, and Patrick Lencioni is one of my favorite business thinkers. He spent a lot of time in organizations and really has innovative thinking about how we should manage and run organizations. And just to illustrate where the best business thinking is on this idea, Lencioni has written, I don't know, 12 or 15 books, and each one of them is a bestseller, and people run their businesses based on his advice. And he's very, very good, very thoughtful. And when he wrote a book called Death by Meeting. And he's talking about how companies run and how all of these different meetings that we have are a challenge to us, and because we don't do them well. And so then he, of course, prescribes a good way to have meetings. And he talks about having 4 meetings, and one of them is the weekly tactical meeting. If you're in an organization, you may be familiar with the weekly status meeting. And Lencioni's contribution is that this meeting could be run a lot better than it typically is. And his contribution in this weekly tactical meeting, so the goal of the weekly tactical is communications and the team working together and everybody understanding where we're going for the week. And if you've ever been in a status meeting, then most of them could in fact be improved, because what typically happens is you go around the table and everybody talks for a little while. And the marketing people talk about marketing, and the custodial people talk about custodial, and the finance people talk about finance. And we don't typically do a great job of managing those conversations, and they get out of hand. And then we don't have time in that structure to focus on the new initiatives and the new projects, on the creative part of what the business needs to be doing, because the operational part of it sucks up all the time. And so Lencioni uses a template for this meeting, and it's pretty involved. And so I'll try to describe it pretty briefly. But one of his innovations is he separates operations from strategy in this agenda. We're going to deal with both, but he has a particular tactic for dealing with each that allows the meeting to develop its own agenda, if you will. And all of the operational things get dealt with first. And it's dealt with a pretty simple system of red light, yellow light, green light. And so we identify each of these operational areas, and the group goes through and assigns it a traffic light. And since it's operations, its traffic light should normally be green. But anybody that's experiencing a problem with this operational part of the company is able to say, no, I've got a problem with that, and turn it into a yellow light or potentially a red light, meaning that the group will talk about it. So we go through all these things, and if it's green, it's green. Great. Everybody's doing a great job over there. Thanks for your contribution. We don't need to talk about green. One of the things that happens in the typical strategy meeting is you go to finance, and the finance representative, usually the vice president of finance or whatever the title is, doesn't have a whole lot to say about how well finance is running, because finance is running just fine. Payroll, for example. Oh, payroll's fine. Well, in a 90-minute strategy meeting, if you're one of 8 people in there, you don't want to take 30 seconds and say, oh, my stuff is fine. So you wind up talking about how fine it is. And I equate that to talking about how green your green light is. And I get it. That's human behavior. I understand it. And people tend to, talk about this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, green is green. That's what we hired you. Okay. We love you. You're doing a great job. Green is a good answer. Let's move on. And so that's how we handle these operational aspects. And the purpose behind that is to deal with them as efficiently as possible, get them dealt with, and get them out of the way, so that the group can focus on higher return on investment activities for this meeting. So we need to communicate about the new product launch. Well, if we spend the whole time talking about how green the green payroll light is, then that's sucking time away from this, I'll say, higher return on investment conversation that we could be having, where we need the whole team to be creative about solving a problem in the new product launch, for example, versus the whole team listening to, again, I'm not picking on payroll, it's just one of these operational aspects, listening to HR talk about how green HR's green light is. And so at the end of the day, operations should have green lights. Your car should run. That's what you expect it to do. That's its normal state. So you wouldn't spend time after you start your car. Well, I occasionally do, but I'm weird. But, just thinking about, wow, how great my car is running and how wonderful it is that overwhelmingly often when I hit the start button, the car starts and it takes me where I need it to take me, and I don't have to worry about it. I don't even have to think about it. A lot of things going on under the hood, I don't even have to worry about them. The car is green. Actually, my car is not green, but the operation of the car is a green light. So let's quit worrying about it. Let's move on to other things. So again, it's not that this is trivial. It's that only under certain circumstances does it require the investment of attention by the whole team. And so we want to make sure that we're controlling that and that it doesn't expand beyond what it needs in terms of taking up the team, the leadership's attention. So this is the operational aspects of a organization or a business. And my argument is that our lives have similar operational aspects. And this is not a great revelation. This is not an aha moment for anybody. But if you give it some thought, it's pretty easy to identify some of those things in our lives that are operational in nature. I mentioned the plumbing, and that's an example, of course. But others are, kind of our processes running smoothly. When we think about how our household runs, are our bills getting paid consistently? Right? If not, what's the problem? Well, we might not have enough money in the bank account. Well, that's one kind of problem. But, hey, my login to the bank, they require a password reset, and somehow that process fouled up. Okay, well, that's a yellow light. We expect to be able to take care of it quickly, but and put that part of our operations back into a green light. But we do need to do it. And more importantly, and this is back to kind of the business approach to this, is it's possible that other people notice that our process is not green before we notice that it's not green. So to get the whole team's input, the customers of this operation, to say, oh, well, you think it's green, but I'm having this problem over here. So let's talk about it briefly. So back to our lives. So we have these operational aspects of our lives. And there is some variation from person to person. I say, I'm not a yard guy. I'm not a gardener. And so in my world, the landscaping of my house, the grass cutting and yard work is really an operational task. It's not something that I think produces a high return on my attentional investment. I need short grass, and I need shrubs that are not overgrown, and I need, mulch beds that don't have a bunch of weeds in them. Other than that, I don't really care. And so in my operations world, to check on the grass, I look out the window and go, is the grass short enough? And if it's not short enough, then that's not a green light. And so then I investigate that process and deal with it. But it should typically be a green light. So we think about that in our lives. And again, my original argument is I think we spend more time on this than we need to. And I'll talk specifically about areas in which we spend more time than we probably need to. So our lives have this operational aspect to them. And just like a well-run business, we want those operations to take up the smallest amount of attention that makes sense in order for them to be well-run. Our own work has operational aspects. And what I mean by that is we have to do our work, but the operational aspects of that are still there. Operational aspects, I work out of my home office. So my computer needs to start when I start it. It needs to run well. It doesn't need to be having problems. I operationalize that and processize that by taking updates, by spending 5 minutes once a week to read the computer rather than, constantly being interrupted by updates. About once a year, I'll spend a couple hours doing some more involved maintenance on the computer. But at the end of the day, that should be something that's just a green light in my life. And I've built process around that, and I'm trying to manage that process. such that the light is green more often than it's not green. And again, we're going back to this notion of our work as part of our lives. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But again, back to this kind of primary notion that we have, which is if we manage our operational things well, just like a business tries to manage its operational things well, then we'll have more time for creative, strategic, spontaneous things, just like a business has more time for creative, strategic things. Now, I will say that in the modern world, we face a little bit of a challenge here because, particularly, I'm going to say in our work lives, we are winding up with more things to manage than we used to have to manage. And I've been down this road a couple of different times in different episodes, but that's because I think it's an important thing. With respect to your work, you have to do more self-management than would have been typical 100 years ago. It's much more rare in the modern economy for us as workers, even as employees, for people to be able to tell us in detail what we need to be doing. So it's very unusual for somebody to be able to assign you a task list in the workplace. Do this, do that, do the other thing. Once you're done with that, do this. And that's a full 8-hour day. Have a nice day. When you come in tomorrow, do the same thing. That's really unusual, I think, in the modern business. And so as this need for us to manage our own stuff grows, then we're facing more challenges in doing it well. Now, what does that have to do with my task list? Well, I would say that we can operationalize the management of our own. And what I mean by that is make it more routine. Now, I would suggest that the way we do that is through implementing the attention compass. That's its purpose, is to help you manage the operational aspects of your life well, such that you can then turn your attention to the more strategic things as there's an opportunity to do so. And I certainly think that's the way that relationship works. So if we can operationalize the management of our own work, and it's more of a burden than you might realize. And I mentioned this before. And if you disagree with me, then it's a real simple matter of just measuring the time that you spend managing your own work, managing your own task list. A lot of people, for example, will spend 20 minutes every morning coming up with their to-do list. Well, I certainly believe that's something that can be routinized and put in as an operational process so that it doesn't take that amount of time every month. I also think there are other problems with to-do lists that I've documented in other episodes. But as we operationalize these things, then they take up less of our attention and we're able to apply more of our attention to other things. So we have these operational things in our lives. There's the traditional stuff like, is my car running? Are the bills getting paid? Is the house in good shape? But we're also facing this need to manage our own work and our own task list, which also, in my opinion, needs to be operationalized. So when we're looking at this operationalization, we want to build in processes and routines. The great thing about processes and routines is while they may require our time, they require less of our focus and attention because we have a process, a habit, a workflow that we gravitate to, and we have to spend less focus, less attention, less mental power on deciding what that process is going to be or on making it up as we go along. And so we have these processes in place. And that's these workflows that I talk about in Attention Compass. And then once we've routinized them, we've operationalized them, then we're in this position where we can focus on them only when they need it, right? Only when something's broken do we have to put a whole bunch of attention on it. The rest of the time, we're sort of on autopilot and we're able to processize things so that we can streamline that process. David Allen at one point famously talked about his work week. And his work week, he said he only wanted to think 2 or 3 or maybe 4 hours a week. And the rest of the time, he just wanted to turn the crank and make the widgets pop out the other end. And that's this real interesting mental picture. I don't know, he never reported how successful he was at doing that, but you think about, a more modern version of that, the 4-hour work week, and how can we manage our work in such a way that it really only takes 4 hours of attention and focus, so that the rest of our attention and focus is freed up for more spontaneous, more creative, and more playful activities, so that we can feel comfortable and not feel like that we're in this routine slog, but to minimize the amount of time that takes. So the point is to make the routine not take up any more time than it needs to. And in the Lencioni model, the routine gets acknowledged, it gets praised, but the time spent on it is minimized so that we can focus on the strategic. As you're thinking about this, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to get email from each one of you and get to know you a little bit better. But I'd love to get email from you specifically. And I would love for you to send me an email. My address is larry@dobusywright.com. You can send me an email and I'll answer it. And we can open up a conversation and start building our relationship at a little bit better level. One of the challenges of a podcast is kind of one-way communication. And so I'd love to hear from you. So if you have a question or a comment or something, a topic you'd like for me to explore, send me an email. And if you can't think of anything else to send me, send me your first name and where you are when you listen to the podcast. And I'd just love to hear from you. And perhaps we can develop a stronger relationship. So zooming back out from that interruption, zooming back out, we're looking at how do we set up our routine such that the operational aspects of our lives are in fact operationalized. And if we're able to do this well, then that will free up time. And I'll talk here in just a second, I'll talk specifically about an instance. So I'll tell you a story and it'll make this real for you. So identify the operational things in your life. Your operational things may not 100% coincide with mine. You may find joy and return on investment out of things that I don't. But we all have some. And so if we can begin to put those things into a system. Now, I will say that one thing that most people don't realize can in fact be routinized and processized is the management of our work. And that's really what Attention Compass is about, is routinizing the management of our work. And when I say the management of our work, what I mean is, what tasks am I responsible for? Is that task list up to date? Because it's probably different than it was yesterday. What are the priorities? Which ones of these things are the most important to attend to now? Am I meeting my deadlines? Am I appropriately available when I need to be? All of these aspects are what Attention Compass really focuses on. And as an added feature, added benefit, we're also able to better manage many of the other things in our lives as well, things like ideas. So this might be a good time to talk about the example and the actual mechanism for how managing your operational aspects well enables you to be more spontaneous rather than less. And I'll tell you a story and I'll ask you to engage in a little bit of a imaginative thought exercise with me. So there you are at your desk on a Tuesday, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're in the middle of your workday. And you're working on a important piece of work, and you finish that piece of work. And if you're an attention compass user, then you know that when you finish a piece of work, often you'll take that as an opportunity to look up and around, to check your information channels, to communicate, to take care of those interim tasks. And the purpose of that is so that after we've done so, and we've done so effectively, then we can get back into another work block and take on the next task with appropriate focus and distraction-free time so that we can get it done. So you've finished the report, and now it's 2 o'clock, and you look up, and one of your emails is, hey, the buddies and I are going to go play 9 holes this afternoon, and our tee time is at 2:45. Can you come? And you back up and start thinking about that. So there are 2 scenarios. In scenario 1, you have a vague pile of things that you expected to get to this afternoon. And there are 6 folders on the corner of your desk. It doesn't matter whether you use folders or not. This is a thought exercise. There's 6 folders on the corner of your desk, and you've got a vague idea that you need to get through them, and that those things are important for today. Okay. And so as you evaluate this opportunity to be spontaneous, what you have to do is you have to say, okay, well, I could go play golf, or I could do the stuff that's in that pile. If the stuff that's in that pile is not well defined, then you can't really know how critical or important it is to get it done. So that pile may have things in it that are high importance and low urgency. Or it may have stuff in it that's a higher priority, which is it's important and urgent. But you don't know because it's in a pile, and that's fairly poorly managed. So most likely your decision is to not go to play golf. Or you may decide, well, heck with the whole pile, I'm going to play golf. And if you do that, then the pile remains on your mind probably while you're playing golf. But most likely you say, no, I've got this pile of work to do, and no, I can't go play golf. Okay, so that's scenario A. Scenario B is you've taken the time to plan your work. You understand what your work is, and you look at your calendar or your task list, and you go, okay, well, what was the next task up for me to deal with? Well, the next task up for me to deal with is to work ahead on the presentation that's due at the end of next week. And that's really what I had planned to do for this afternoon. So now you've identified the one task, and you've pre-identified this. You've identified the one task that's going to have your attention this afternoon. Now you can evaluate one-to-one, and you can compare going to play golf with your buddies and the value of doing that with a specific piece of work. And that's a much easier decision to make than if you have to compare it to a pile of work, because a pile of work, you can't know what's in it. And so for this reason, I know that I'm much more spontaneous when my operational stuff is well managed, and my clients report a similar outcome. And this one-to-one comparison in a well-managed workflow is much, much easier and much more accurate than any sort of one-to-many comparison. And so that's one of the mechanisms by which spontaneity and creativity is actually improved, by having the operational stuff in our world well managed. We've already identified what our work is, we know its value, and we're able to make this one-to-one comparison. And so that's just one example of it's easier to be spontaneous in a well-managed world. And I think that has parallels back to Lencioni's weekly tactical meeting structure. Is you can say, okay, we've dealt with the operational stuff. We know nothing's on fire. So now we can fully focus. Everybody said what they have to say. We can fully focus on these strategic aspects and this higher return on investment use of the group's attention. So that's a little bit of a complicated set of thoughts, but I ask you just to think through and really imagine, your pile of stuff or your stack of daily to-do lists, all of which have bits and pieces of things that are done or undone on them, versus having identified the one thing that needs your attention this afternoon, and your ability to make the decision on whether or not to go play golf based on those two scenarios. So I'll give you a few takeaways and then we'll recap. And the takeaways are: begin to operationalize these things. You may, I suggest, having a weekly tactical meeting with yourself. So begin this process of identifying the operational in your world, and begin the process of identifying it as a green light or not green light. Yellow and red's a little bit challenging, but it's either green or it's not. And if it's not, it probably needs some of your attention. And make yourself a list of those things and deal with them weekly. Are the bills paid? Yes, no. Am I developing my work processes? Yes, no. Do I create my task list? Yes, no. And are these things well managed? And I think that what you'll find when you do that is that it frees you up from the stress of not knowing and being fearful that something's going to jump up out of one of those places, that one of those lights is not green and you don't know about it. Now, this will involve, over time, this will involve you having standards for what's green and not green, but those standards are your own standards. When I say, are the bills paid? You may have a different standard for, yes, the bills are paid, than I do. I have a little bit different standard for, is the grass in good shape, than other people have. Other people, if they see a weed, then their yard light turns from green to yellow. Oh, it's a weed. I got to go deal with it. I don't have that same standard. And so you'll find yourself working through these various standards, but identify those operational aspects and begin to think about them briefly. Are they in good shape? Other things you may want to consider adding to that is, are my communications up to date? Meaning, when's the last time I had communications? When's the last time I dealt with email? Okay. My standard for dealing with email is about once every 90 minutes. That standard may be effective for you, it may not. It depends on your environment and your particular job. But if it's been 90 minutes or less since I dealt with email and I'm about to deal with email, then the light's green. And it stays green for 90 minutes. So that during that time, I can apply my attention to other things and not worry about it. So this cyclical, are the lights green? Okay. And begin to develop both the categories of lights that you think are important, along with some standard for the whole green versus not green question. So as we clarify that standard, then what will happen is we'll begin to identify areas where the things that most often turn that green light off. And then we'll be able to say, okay, well, this is symptomatic of a process that needs to be improved. And then we'll be able to address that process. So your standard for the yard might be similar to mine. Is it less than what? 8 inches tall? If so, the light's green. And then you begin to measure this operational task in your world, and you track it a little bit. By a little bit, I don't mean you don't track it well. I mean, you just don't track a whole lot of different components of it. You look once in a while and you go, is it less than 8 inches? Yes. And you check the box. And if it doesn't meet your standard on a consistent basis, then there's an opportunity for you to refine the process that creates this green light in your work. Maybe you need a different yard guy. Maybe you need to take it out of the hands of your 16-year-old and put it in the hands of a professional. Or maybe you need to instruct your 16-year-old a little bit more. But the point is, these operational things should typically be green. If they're consistently not green, then you've got an area that you can apply some of your attention and effort to in order to consistently keep that light green. And then over time, you'll find that that takes less and less and less of your attention. And thus you can put that attention on other, more creative, higher return on investment activities. And so this process, this one big takeaway, if you will, this process is this whole operationalization of an aspect of our world. And we go back then to managing the operational aspects of our lives. And as we do this, again, the theory, and I think there's huge evidence in favor of this theory, is that we'll have more opportunity for the other uses of our attention as we move through our week. So again, the steps for the takeaway are: 1, have a weekly tactical meeting with yourself and begin to identify these operational things and list them. 2 is clarify your standard for green or not green. Figure out a way to measure it that's pretty easy, and do that on a routine basis. The first part of your weekly tactical meeting with yourself may be, okay, step 1 is go stick a ruler in the grass. Is it less than 8 inches? Yes, no. It's green, right? And all these different ways in which you have a standard for that green light, and clarify that for yourself. And then over time, you'll detect which areas the light is most challenging to keep green. And then that will allow you to begin to investigate your process for keeping that light green. And all this work at the end will produce a much more operationalized part of your life for those things that are operational to you. Now, if you're a gardener, then your yard is not really an operational kind of task. It's more of a strategic kind of task. And so you have a very different standard and a very different plan for how much of your attention you'll allocate in this area. And so you enjoy doing it. So you like doing it a lot. So your standard will be very different. And you won't worry so much about, well, is the light green or not? You'll have much more nuanced categories of, is this where I want it? And you'll have much more detailed plans for getting it where you want it and keeping it there. But for those operational things in your world, operationalize and processize those. A really good example of something that may need operationalization in your life is how you deal with incoming information. And again, I talked about email a few minutes ago. If I've dealt with email in the last 90 minutes, then my light is green. And I've developed that process over a period of time, and I've trained people in how to communicate with me and all these different ideas. And so it wasn't a snap my fingers thing and made it happen, but it was something that I was able to do over a period of time. So those communications can be particularly challenging in our own work life. Not work, but work life, like space time. And we want to give attention to them in the appropriate ways. Social media is a consistent whipping boy on the Do Busy Right podcast. And so think about your engagement with those operational aspects. What does it mean for your social media to be well tended? And can it, in fact, be operationalized in your life? And all the communication channels are similar in that they can and probably should be operationalized to some degree. So think about that. Have a weekly meeting with yourself. Go over your list of operational things. Operationalize them to a greater degree if they're consistently not green. And I think that you'll find that you're in a position to be able to give them less consistent attention and be able to focus your attention on the more spontaneous, the more creative, the more fun areas of your life. And so that's my takeaway here. In the bigger picture, just as review, we started talking about this notion that process and operationalization makes us less creative, and that I hear a lot about, well, I don't want to make my life rigorous. My argument is that processizing does not necessarily mean rigidity. It means that you've operationalized the correct areas of your life. And that's a very personal decision, what constitutes operationalization. I think bill paying should be operationalized. You may be very interested in your household finance, and that may be more like a hobby for you. You may find great value in managing your home finances. It's fine. It's your standard. It's not mine. And you don't want to operationalize that. That's fine. Maybe there's some other area in which you want to operationalize. I spend a lot of time reading, for example, and that is increasingly rare. And so a lot of people operationalize their information input through that channel by, not reading. And so that's fine, no judgment. But you can allocate your time well and your attention well by deciding what's going to be operationalized in you. And that will free up your attention to focus on things that are not operational for you, but are in fact strategic, life-giving activities in your work. So it's a lot to think about at once. I will again ask that you reach out to me, send me an email. I'd really appreciate it. And I will show my appreciation when I reply to your email. If you can't think of anything else to email me about, and the topics are, feel free to email me about the show, things you're interested in, questions you have, areas you think I should tackle. And if you can't think of any of that, then just shoot me an email, give me your first name and where you listen from. And maybe that'll be an open door for us to begin to communicate and build a stronger relationship. So I hope that you'll do that for me. If you've gotten some value out of the podcast, then that's a way that you can return some of that value. And so I would love to hear from you. And then finally, I'll just say, think about what we've talked about today. Think about the 3 steps that I laid out for you. Think about the value of operationalizing certain things in your life. In particular, think about operationalizing your own task management so that it takes up less of your focus and attention. And then we can think about, well, how would you best do that? I will suggest Attention Compass because that's what I designed it to do, but there are other solutions as well. So if there's any of that going on in your world, and that's another great reason to send me an email. So I look forward to hearing from you. And this is a call to you individually. So love my listeners, want to hear from you. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.